Mr. Barr for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Secretary. Good to see you. Welcome back to Congress.
Nice to see
You know, the outcome of the Basel III endgame proposal by federal banking regulators will be less conventional bank financing in the mortgage space, reducing access to mortgage credit, increasing credit costs, especially for traditionally underserved communities. As noted in a previous hearing in my subcommittee, under the proposal, every $1 million of capital an impacted bank allocates to mortgage lending would equate under the proposal to at least $7 million less lending to first-time homebuyers who can't make a 20% down payment. In July, a coalition of housing associations, including the National Urban League and the NAACP, wrote to federal banking regulators warning that this Basel III endgame proposal will undercut efforts to close the racial homeownership gap and will disadvantage first-time homebuyers. Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to submit a copy of that letter for the record.
Without objection.
And let me, Madam Secretary, read to you what the NAACP and the Urban League wrote. If these standards are adopted, the Basel III endgame standards, they will have a devastating impact on our efforts to increase black home ownership and disadvantage all first-time and in particular first-generation homebuyers who do not have the benefit of multi-generational wealth or higher than average incomes. Secretary Fudge, have you spoken with Federal Reserve Vice Chair for Supervision Michael Barr about the Basel III proposal, given that it directly conflicts with your goal of affordable home ownership?
I have not, because they deal with conventional mortgages and we do not.
Well, I just think that given the mission of HUD, given the mission of achieving more affordable home ownership, and the fact that the Fed's proposal and Mr. Barr's proposal runs directly counter to that mission is something that should concern your department, and there needs to be a recognition that groups like the NAACP and the National Urban League are very concerned with what the Fed is potentially proposing here. Madam Secretary, some of my Democrat colleagues have argued that the housing first approach to dealing with homelessness should be the only or exclusive approach to addressing homelessness. But since its inception about a decade ago, data had proved that housing first has really failed. And that previous advocates are starting to change their tune. In January 2023, as you noted in your testimony, point-in-time count report released last month, HUD announced more than 650,000 people were experiencing homelessness in January of 2023, a 12% increase from 2022. And recently, the president of the left-leaning National Low-Income Housing Coalition, Diane Yentl, recently stated, and I quote, "Using the housing first approach, homeless systems cannot keep up with increased inflow. In many communities, for every person who has successfully moved from homelessness into housing, more than one other becomes newly homeless," end quote. And even in San Francisco, the city that knows more about homelessness than any other in this country, is abandoning housing first. In September, Mayor London Breed unveiled a plan that requires that any resident receiving welfare to comply with drug testing and treatment. Do you acknowledge, Madam Secretary, that HUD's own data show that the housing first approach to homelessness is not solving, but actually deepening the homelessness problem?
I would not agree with that. What I would say is the data we have shows housing first does work. But let me just be clear. Housing first is not the only way to do housing.
Oh, I love to hear that. I think we have a point of agreement there because I agree with you. And what I would say is, even to my friends who are the housing first advocates out there, let's add to the tools in the toolbox. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Obviously we're not succeeding in the fight against homelessness. So let's try everything is my view. And I want HUD to consider following San Francisco's lead in abandoning an exclusive housing first approach. Let me finally, in my remaining time, Madam Secretary, read to you an anecdote from a not-for-profit organization in my district, part of the Citygate Network, that talks about how an alternative to housing first actually works. This is from the Lexington Rescue Mission. Steve came to the mission at a low point in his life. Addiction and drugs to alcohol had led to separation from his wife and an arrest. And he said, that changed my life forever. I might not be alive today if that hadn't happened. I realized God was looking out for me even when I didn't think he was. After incarceration, Steve went into treatment for his addiction, and it was at the recovery program that he learned at the Lexington Rescue Mission and applied for a place at the Potter's House the transitional home. I didn't have a job. I didn't have a place to go. I was homeless. I didn't have footing, but it was the best decision I made in my life. At the mission, Steve found support, accountability, and a community needed for a foundation. Steve received more than just a bed at the mission. He found help with accessing treatment for addiction, getting a job, setting a budget, saving money, life skills, building support system. Because of this, he turned his life around and reestablished a relationship with his kids. This
Gentleman's
program
expired.
is not allowed under Housing First. And we need to recognize that these groups deserve HUD assistance as well. And with that, I yield back and thank you for your open-mindedness on that point.